Small and punchy games of Warhammer 40K set aboard a Space Hulk. Let's talk through the full rules of Games Workshop's new Boarding Actions expansion. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a brand new expansion for Warhammer 40K and going through these new boarding action rules in full. I feel like quite a few people are at least fairly curious to try a few games of this. A new game mode for 40k based around small 500-point armies duking it out inside a Space Hulk, with a bit more of an emphasis on small squad tactics and perhaps cutting out a fair amount of some of the more bloated things in 40k in general. So in a nutshell, Warhammer 40k Boarding Actions is a different way to play the same game of 40k. It's a completely optional game mode that you don't have to play in match play or anything. It uses most of the Warhammer 40k core rules, but a fair few adaptations to them for fighting indoors and some very different terrain and mission rules. The armies are small, 500-point armies with a fairly limited unit selection of just certain battlefield roles, and no big monsters or vehicles. It means that games are fairly quick and punchy, and you could be playing a game within something like an hour to an hour and a half, compared with the slightly longer affairs that bigger games of 40k tend to be. The missions are played on this new terrain board that Games Workshop have got, a smaller map than some games of Warhammer 40k, and the main terrain rules are walls and hatches and things, and squads interacting and fighting in and around them. It's kind of similar to the old 40k Zone Mortalis tiles that they used to have in ages past. I'd say that the game mode probably isn't aimed to be anything super competitive or anything. Games Workshop aren't going to be trying to rebalance this every so often, and it more feels like a bit of a fun mini game to try out and have some casual games with. I feel like fighting it out with small squads and making a big deal of some individual model positioning could be quite nice, and it feels like a bit of a halfway house between 40k and Kill Team. In theory, what you'd need to play this would be 500 points worth of models, though armies are limited to some rather specific sets of units, as we'll get onto later. The rules for the expansion, which are found in the Arks of Omen Abaddon book, and apparently later expansions in the Arks of Omen series will build and expand on it, with things like different stratagems and rules options for the different 40k races. Probably the single most important thing to have, though, is an appropriate set of terrain. The missions do seem to be really quite heavily designed for the specific terrain kits that Games Workshop have released with this boarding actions thing, which maybe isn't ideal news, as it's really quite expensive compared with what I was expecting. £130, €170, or $210. I feel like quite a lot of people are going to look at that price and just say nope, particularly as I'm not entirely sure exactly how long of a rule shelf life this will have. Maybe Games Workshop will adapt it so you can play it in 10th edition, but maybe not. I feel like you're probably going to get a fair few people improvising either with some cardboard terrain or maybe third party or 3D printed setups, but it would take at least a little bit of effort to get that sort of thing going, particularly as for a lot of the missions in the book at least, the terrain setups are fairly specific, which could be a bit annoying if you've got your own custom set that doesn't quite match Games Workshop's. The board that they're played on is two separate tiles placed next to each other, a setup that's just over 70 centimeters by 121, quite small compared with Warhammer 40k, and they're broken down into a grid system of 12 by 7 squares. The squares give you a bit of an idea of where to lay out all these ruined walls along. For setting up an actual game of boarding actions, each mission has its set terrain as we mentioned. It's kind of interesting seeing the deployment maps. They give you really quite set places where you put things like hatches and each individual bit of terrain. Every bit of terrain is kind of coded with its own lettering system, so in theory one wall goes there, another wall goes somewhere else. It means with that Games Workshop terrain you probably want to leave a lot of it unglued so you can clip things in and out. I guess the idea is that it's supposed to be quite modular and you can set it up to different terrain maps. I feel like it could mean that there's a fair bit of work clipping things in and out to set up a new terrain map, maybe more so than regular 40k where you just plonk down a whole bunch of ruins. I feel like if you have terrain that doesn't necessarily match this exactly, you could probably still make workable missions, maybe just roughly copy the general theme of what Games Workshop has going on these maps, and I suspect that you'd probably be fine. When you're deploying forces on them, there's a bunch of squares that are noted as entry zones. They're the places where you can set up your units. The way it works is that you alternate deploying your units with your opponents, like in 40k at the moment. It's interestingly just one unit per deployment zone, and then anything else that's left over gets put in strategic reserve. Those units can emerge from any of the entry zones starting right from turn 1, or if they've got a special rule like teleporting Terminators for example, they can either come in the same way or set up anywhere on the board greater than 9 inches away all the way from turn 2. There's a few other twists to the rules, such as forward deployment units like Space Marine Infiltrators or Scouts. They get to set up 6 inches away from the entry zone rather than just right on it. so they're a bit more limited than they would be before, but that still seems like a major advantage. Your Warlord as well, they can share an entry zone with a unit too, so they can come down with the squad placed at the same time. When you actually get to playing a game of boarding actions, the vast majority of the phases of Warhammer 40k happen the same. You get your command phase, then movement, psychic, shooting, assault, and leadership. Most of the rules tweaks are either to army building or to make these small unit sizes work well with the terrain, and there seems to be quite a lot of an emphasis on line of sight and making any walls being true dividing lines between units so they can't affect each other. Unlike Warhammer 40k, where there's a lot of abstraction with units going in and out of ruined walls just for sake of simplicity, in this they're very much immutable objects. You can't go through them unless there's an actual open hatch. One of the interesting ways that that works is that aura abilities don't go through walls. You actually have to measure around open space. Like say for example this Necron warrior to the Space Marine, you'd have to see how far they'd be next to each other around that pillar in terms of determining how far away from each other are, even for things like auras. Line of sight and things also comes into big effect in the shooting phase, unlike in regular 40k, where again there's a bit of abstraction and squads can draw line of sight through each other. In the shooting phase, line of sight has to be really quite direct. You have to draw a point line to anywhere on your target model, and that line can't cross friendly models in your same unit, any other friendly models, or any enemy models that aren't part of your target unit. For example, in the top picture, the Space Marine couldn't draw line of sight to the Necron squad on the right because it's shielded by the Necron squad on the left. There's no way that he can get line of sight to the second squad because it's entirely blocked off by the first two spaces. Cover also works kind of interestingly as well. You have to be able to draw line of sight to the entire model's base if they're not going to get obscured and get +1 to their saves. So in that second picture, Model D wouldn't get any cover, Model C would get some cover from the Space Marine shooting, and then Model B wouldn't be able to be shot because you'd be drawing line of sight through a wall. Finally, and perhaps just so shooting isn't the only thing that's impacted by these line of sight changes, there's also a rule that you can only charge what you can see as well. So it means that even if you are super close to an enemy unit but they happen to be just round a corner, you wouldn't be able to charge them that turn. There's perhaps a bit more emphasis as to what you can actually move in your movement phase, as opposed to any big buffs to how far you can charge. The same goes for heroic intervention as well. You can only heroic intervene against a unit that you can see if you're a character. Another really quite core part of the main rules are hatchways as well. These are really common doors that you can open and close on Games Workshop's kits. There's a lot of them on their deployment maps, and they've got some quite interesting rules where you can open and close them to maybe help you assault or defend an area, and a fair bit of fighting might well take place from one side to another. The hatchways basically count as walls when they're closed. They're going to block any units having any interaction with each other. But if you've got a unit within 1 inch of them at the end of the move unit step, then you can do an action to open the hatch. That action completes at the start of the shooting phase, so you can still shoot after doing it. It just stops you doing it if you've come in from reserve, I guess, and it will impede movement a bit, because basically you're going to make a normal move up to the hatchway and then not be able to go any further until you've opened it. One thing that I think is quite fun for it as well is that if there's, say, enemies on the other side of the hatchway, they can try and prevent you opening it. You roll off and you add your strength, and the winner gets to either decide whether the hatchway gets opened or closed. I guess it means that you could have some units trying to block off a route of access, perhaps by desperately trying to close the doors on a more powerful foe. When the hatchways are open, they basically count as open ground. You'd be able to draw line of sight through them and everything, and it actually is slightly easier to be fighting in melee with an enemy unit over the other side of a hatchway. If you're drawing engagement range through one of them, then you get a 2-inch engagement range rather than one. I guess this is another way that you could perhaps defend a hatchway. Have a unit on one side of it, and then if the enemy does manage to open it despite a roll off, then you'd suddenly be in engagement range with them, potentially able to hit them hard in combat if, say, you had some good melee troops there. The rules for that seem at least fairly fun and intuitive, opening and closing those bulkheads as you move across the ship, and perhaps having a tussle with the enemies on the other side. Those are perhaps some of the main changes, but there are quite a lot of other small alterations to core 40k that perhaps are quite intelligent moves for small games or close confines. First up, objectives are a little bit smaller in radius. You only get to control them if you're within 1 inch of them now, not 3 as in regular 40k. Again, that perhaps makes individual model positioning just a bit better and make big models very good at defending them. There's also quite an interesting action that you can do on objectives called Secure Sight. Again, that one starts at the end of your movement until your next command phase. If the unit manages to do that action, then it means that the site is secured and you're allowed to move off the objective, and it'll remain yours until your opponent manages to put any models on it. That seems quite fun, maybe a bit of sweep and clear type mechanics where you get to hold down a point and then take the fight to the enemy and try and battle on the front line. There's a couple of changes to damage dealing. Witch fires will all target the closest visible model now. You can't use them to snipe, even if the rules are allowing that in regular rules. And barrage weapons lose their indirect fire for fairly obvious reasons. If you try and fire a mortar indoors, it's probably going to end badly. The rules for fighting with piling and consolidate are a little bit tighter as well. You can only do them if you're bringing your unit into engagement range with an enemy. Otherwise, you can't use them to gain a bit of free movement, which I think would be really powerful in this game mode. Finally, for command points, you start on 1 command point at the start of the game, gain 1 command point per each of your command phases, and they're just going to be a bit less relevant in general, only getting the 3 core Warhammer 40k stratagems: Insane Bravery to auto-pass morale, the command point reroll, and counter-offensive to interrupt combat. Most standard 40k book stratagems are just completely banned and not in this game mode, so a lot of armies are going to lose some of their craftiest tricks. Apparently a few of the expansion books will add a few more options, things that are specific to the game mode for individual factions, but from this book at least, they're starting out fairly basic. Finally, for just one other thing that a lot of units can do when they're on the board, every unit in the game gains the option to either set Overwatch or set to defend if they're not doing much else, and unless you're actually engaging the enemy, I suppose it would usually make sense to do one of these each turn. Both of these are basically defensive actions that your units can do as they're creeping around the corridors. The action happens from the end of your move unit step, and then both of these complete at the end of your turn, and basically give you a bit of a counter-attack type buff when the enemy comes calling. The set to defend one is nice and simple. That one just gives you a +1 to hit in melee in your opponent's turn, so it makes your combat troops just a little bit more vicious if they didn't hit on 2s already. The set Overwatch one is maybe just a little bit more involved. It gives you 2 different options. Either you get to shoot in your opponent's turn when they finish a move, fall back, or arrive from reserves within line of sight of your unit, or when they complete a charge move against you, though you can only shoot against the models in engagement range then. Doing the action it basically allows you to use one single round of Overwatch fire, hitting on 6s in a similar way to the core book. Though there are a few rules in Warhammer 40k in general that allow you to hold steady to hit on 5s, including one of the enhancement type things when you're mustering armies, which we'll get onto in a second. If you're allowed to do that basically all the time, I feel like any auto-hitting weapons with things like flamethrowers could actually be really quite powerful here. They'd be able to get you basically a free round of shooting when the enemy rounds the corner, which doesn't seem too bad at all, particularly if you're fighting light infantry. Those are the majority of the game mechanics besides the mission rules, but first let's talk about mustering an army, something that Games Workshop showed off a fair bit of a couple of weeks ago, though there are a few interesting clarifications within this book. As previewed, each boarding action's army consists of 500 points. You have to use this mini patrol detachment, up to 1 HQ, up to 3 troops and up to 3 elites. There's no mandatory slots whatsoever, but by default you can't use any fast attack or heavy support unless your individual codex's rules have an exception. Admittedly, there are quite a lot of exceptions. Things like Flesh Hounds and Space Marine Hellblasters can be fielded, but there are a lot of units that are just outright banned. You can't field any monsters, no vehicles, no bikes, cavalry, or fly units, again unless you've got a specific exemption to them. For example, Tau Empire can still field their battle suits, but they change their movement characteristic to 6 and have to go walking about. You can technically field one monster datasheet as well in Reboot Gilliman. Another pretty interesting mechanic in Arks of Omen are the boarding squads. In general, the requirement is that most units must be pretty much on the small side. Any units that have a minimum size of less than 5 must be fielded in their minimum amount. So say 3 Space Marine Aggressors for example. If your unit size is a minimum of 5, then you can either choose to field it as a 5 or a 10-man unit, and for the most part, if you field them in 10s, you usually have to split the unit into 2 5s, kind of similar to Space Marine combat squads. A few Horde-style units have a special rule within the Codex sections where they get to remain whole, say for example Imperial Guard Infantry or Tyranid Termagants. Regardless of anything else though, you can't take units of a squad size over 10. In general, I feel like some units might have a bit more survivability against ranged units, particularly big units where you could hide some units round a corner but some models in line of sight. The enemy will only be able to kill so much. Then finally you nominate a Warlord. and they get to pick one of 6 different enhancements to make them a bit better in some way. These basically replace any Warlord traits or relics, so again those sections are completely gone from the codexes for this game mode. These are those 6 enhancements. You get to choose one of them for your Warlord, provided that Warlord isn't a named character. Apparently there's going to be some faction-specific ones of these coming in the later books. Could add a few more themed options, though these ones do seem pretty generally serviceable. Superior Boarding Tactics gives you a +2 CP at the game's start. Close Quarter Killers allows you to reroll wounds in melee. Defensive Linchpin gives you a 6-inch aura of 5+ Overwatch. Not bad for that mechanic, I guess. Expert Breacher allows you to open a hatchway with that character before making a normal move. Quite handy, as it means, I guess, you could open the hatchway and then surge forward and attack the enemy. Personal Teleporter gives them Deep Strike. You get to either arrive from reserve from within an entry zone as normal or anywhere greater than 9 inches from the enemy. Could allow them to set up in some gamey places. And finally, sort of a relic option in Trademark Weapon. +1 strength and +1 damage to one weapon on the datasheet. Could be either range or melee. Most of those potentially seem fairly useful to me, to be honest. Rerolling wounds in combat's rarely going to be bad for a fighting character, and I feel like that trademark weapon is some nice reliable extra damage, and command points for rerolls are never bad either. Then, with the core rules of the boarding patrol and the enhancements, then you move on to each of the faction's special rules. I have covered all of these in a previous video on the channel, which I'll link down in the video description. A lot of these just address the oddball mechanics of each army, and they're basically aimed to do a few different things, make sure they're not breaking the game too hard in any one way, making them fit in with the law of fighting indoors and not going swooping around or jumping down from the skies, and generally messing around with which units you can or can't take and the numbers of them to make them fit in with that boarding squads rule. Just a few broad themes out of them are that generally you have to be the same chapter legion or equivalent as with normal 40k. Psychic powers got a fair few of their mechanics tweaked, as they're one of the big rule sections in 40k that stays. A bunch of witchfires seem to cost more to cast, particularly any area of effect ones. There's a fair few restrictions to certain teleporting options, say for example massively higher cost on psychic powers like Dad Jump, and plenty of war gear options are just unusable. Some double move psychic powers are also restricted a bit like warp time as well. Generally speaking, units lose rules like fly and outflank. Some units that dropped down from the sky, like Town Manta Strike, loses their Deep Strike. Certain army traits are tweaked a fair bit, such as say like the Raven Guard or Styges 8 equivalent ones, where you get some sort of cover outside of a certain distance. That's now reduced to 6 inches for those. Otherwise, it'd basically never take effect. Some scout rules are tweaked a bit to be moving just a certain distance from your entry zone, and game-wide OBSEC armies tend to have their models count as double models rather than OBSEC. As mentioned, there's a fair few changes to specific amounts of numbers that you can take for units. A lot of armies allow you to take, say, 1 heavy support or 1 fast attack slot. Some units you can only take set amounts of and are tweaked to fit in with the boarding squads, and sometimes you need some lore appropriate characters to unlock some whole army wide special rules, say for example a Skitarii Marshal for the Doctrine or Imperatives. If you want to see the specifics, I'll link the video where I talked about each of them down in the video description. Finally, with all the core mechanics established, you need the actual missions to play and the ways that you win games. It seems that there's 9 different missions within the book. A lot of them are themed on taking one part of the ship, and the map setups generally have 4 different entry points for each player, and are usually fighting over 4 different objectives somewhere in the midfield. A few of them do shake up the format in a few interesting ways, and the terrain is all set out, showing you where the hatches need to be, and where all the walls get set up. Each of the missions has a little thing called an underdog bonus as well, a small advantage for a side that happens to have 30 points or more fewer. I feel like most armies should be able to fit into the boarding actions patrol and have the vast majority of their points filled, but I suppose it's not impossible that you might have less. The missions are 5-round games, the same as normal Warhammer 40k. I was perhaps wondering if they might have been a little bit longer, given that units can hide quite well, and you might spend a little bit of time opening those hatches, but it seems that it's usually just 5 turns. Just for one example of a mission, this one's apparently called Access Junction Primus. Looks like it's aimed to be set out over a big crossroads or something like that, and there's 2 objectives to win the game. First up, capture the junction, which you get 5 victory points in your command phase for holding 1 objective, holding 2 objectives, or holding more objectives than your opponents. 15 victory points per turn, kind of similar to most 40k missions. And then the other one is a kill type objective, one called Purge the Ship. At the end of the game, you add up the points of the enemy units killed. If you've killed 125 points worth of units, you get 15 victory points, 250 for 30, or 375 for the full 45. A bit more straightforward and less involved than the big secondary system of 40k, though as a result it's probably going to leave a fair few more matchups where one player just really has a bit of a disadvantage based on the mission that they're playing. The underdog bonus for this one means that you start on 1 extra CP, not exactly hugely game changing, but not unhelpful. Overall, my initial impressions of this one would be that it looks kind of fun to try. Looks like it'll play very differently to Warhammer 40k, and with the amount of thought that's gone into the mission setups and the units that you can and can't bring, I feel like it might be a bit more of an interesting gaming experience than Combat Patrol, provided you didn't want to use any big things like vehicles, I suppose. The smaller squads and positioning of individual models do look really quite fun. It does seem like it's almost a bit of a halfway house between Big 40k and Kill Team. I do think that barrier to entry is going to be pretty annoying to quite a lot of people, though. If you go purely the Games Workshop way, then you're going to be spending around about $270 or around £160 on books plus terrain. That's be far too much for a 40k expansion for a whole load of people. Though I suppose if you had a big group of like-minded people, you could maybe split a cost within the group and get some good use out of it. Another thing that might just be a little bit against people adopting this on a big way is that it's just a bit of a mental load to remember a bunch of extra minor tweaks to the game, even if they do make sense for it. The game does seem like it's been pretty well thought out, but if you're hopping to and from big 40k, I guess sometimes it might be a bit tricky to remember things like doing the actions, or changing the warp charge cost for some of your psychic powers, or doing piling and consolidate in a different way. In general though, if you can be bothered to get a terrain set up and running, whether Games Workshop or something converted, I feel like this will be a fun game mode to try out. I feel like some people are going to get some really good value out of this. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below though. What are your initial impressions of Arks of Omen's boarding actions? Would you be tempted to play it, or are you kind of happy sticking with either Big 40k or Kill Team instead? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.